Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, Introvert Myth of the Week. Introverts don't have loud voices. Leadership Tip of the Week. Consider your ego when communicating with your team. Question of the Week. Does having a big ego mean you have to be extroverted? And a discussion with Mike Pagan. Mike is a mental wealth strategist who believes isolation kills creativity and prevents decision making. Just before speaking to Mike, in the news this week, there's lots of sports events. Cyclists crashing in the Tour de France. There's Wimbledon, and apparently England did well in the football at the weekend. I also read about the 50 biggest egos in football. Many sports people openly show great displays of emotion, whether they've just won a game or lost. That might make sense given the pressure and the desire to win. Displays of emotion might be something introverts are less prone to, but we do get excited and do display emotions. All the hugging on a football pitch does not mean all footballers are extroverts. Perhaps it was this that led to a few discussions about sporting success, having a big ego, being egotistical, and links to the business world. Essentially boiling down to, do you need a big ego to succeed? And does that rule out introverts? Just before jumping into that though, the funniest part in the article is what they called the quintessential ego moment. And I quote, "Giving yourself a nickname is pretty self-absorbed and obnoxious no matter who you are or what you do." And Mourinho took this deed to legendary heights by bestowing the title of the Special One upon himself. I'm not really sure who the Special One is, but it seems to echo the calls of some business leaders who call themselves gurus or the global expert. My view? Call yourself a specialist in business by all means, but the expert? What do you think? I certainly don't have a monopoly on being right on this. Add a comment in the Facebook group to the related discussion. But a couple of definitions that might help. Ego, the self. We all have one of these, although much common language use nowadays refers to having a very strong sense of self and self-importance. Egotistical. Someone who is egotistical is full of herself, completely self-absorbed. I can see why this might be seen in many high-flying, successful business people, although it certainly isn't essential. The best leaders I've ever worked for have not been like this at all, although very driven. Introvert, a person who derives their energy when spending time alone, largely because of a greater sensitivity to dopamine, meaning they're more likely to get overstimulated and overtired when with a group of people, unlike extroverts, who tend to be energized by being with people. Success needs vision, drive, communication skills, and networking skills. I don't know. What do you think is missing maybe? Maybe you think there's other essential qualities of success. Do add them to the Facebook page. Certainly, none of the success prerequisites I've thought of are extrovert only. And there are many successful introverts. Even though, according to the HR director, 73% of company directors are extroverted. What's the relevance of any of this? Extroversion is not a requirement of success, even though we live in an extrovert-biased society. Knowing that most introverts dislike an overly egotistical approach, and let's be honest though, many extroverts do as well, might make you reconsider your communications and your style when working with your team. And wow, all of that from the question of the week, where Pete asked, does having a strong ego mean you can't be introverted? Thank you, Pete. What question would you like answered on the show? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered like Pete, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also follow on Facebook and discuss the answers at the show's page, Activate Your Introvert. And of course, if there's a particular myth you'd like explored or issue that stops you getting the most from the quieter people in your team, do let me know. The mission of this show is to help you with understanding introversion and building your business. But now, It's time to talk to Mike. Welcome, Mike.
Hi there, John. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant to have a discussion, and what a timely discussion. Whilst people are talking about mental health and lockdown and possibly unlockdown, whatever's happening at the moment.
Whatever comes next, yes.
You've just written a book about mental wealth?
Yes, indeed. Very much focused on building the right support network around you so that we're not struggling or challenging ourselves with being in isolation.
Just before we go into that, I always ask my guests, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And more importantly, what does that mean to you?
Part one of that question, when I'm working with young adults, when I'm working with businessmen and women, I will always focus on being a chameleon, which basically means if you meet me, most people would assume I'm an extrovert because I have a voice which is quite loud, apparently. So the assumption is your volume is loud, therefore you must be an extrovert. Whereas actually in social loud situations, I turn the volume on. Outside of that, I'm far quieter, albeit I do chuckle and laugh as often as possible. So I'm nearer extrovert than I am introvert, but I'm not pure extrovert, which is where many people would put me.
And I love that distinction and almost a little bit of that myth, as you say. People assume you're extroverted because you have a loud voice, which has got absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever. But
yeah,
interesting. I might steal that myth for another week. So you wrote a book, Mental Wealth, Unlock Your Potential and Enrich Your Life. What led you into writing that?
One of the areas I was really focusing on is the introduction piece you said, which was isolation kills creativity and prevents decision making. And an ongoing side effect of that is also having a potentially detrimental effect to somebody's mental health because we are doing that isolation piece. It's no surprise why prisoners in jail were put in isolation as a punishment, because we are social beings. We are meant to be able to work with others. And when we are trapped in isolation, then that causes problems. And when we have the right support network around us, the right proactive team, then we can bounce back from problems. We can ask questions. We can be supportive more effectively. And when I was writing the book, sadly, one of my friends took his own life due to challenges within his life and everything else. He decided the time was right to go. The observation of that for me was his support network wasn't right for him at that time. And I'm not saying that had I asked him a question at an event and told him what I was writing, I'd have changed the outcome. But it proved to me that he wasn't getting the support he needed. People weren't asking the right questions of him at that time around his mental health. And it really gave me a clear avatar of who I was writing the book for. And it was to make sure that people have got the right support, so they're asking the right questions. So even though they might come across as the big bonhomie and the big social everything else, doesn't mean to say that there isn't an awful lot going on in the background that we don't know about, which is where the negative mental health chapters occur, and they need that support.
I often hear about introverts, bringing it back there for a second, certainly during the pandemic. It's the year of the introvert because we're all locked down at home, which I always said was complete rubbish. But actually, you're going further than that and saying even if you are perhaps extroverted, you still need that support team, whether you're introvert or extrovert.
Absolutely.
Do you see any difference?
Because the extrovert will put on this big bonhomie, the big noise, quite often at a party, but actually it's skin deep because they are vulnerable and there's other things going on. Sadly, the people I know over the last few years who have gone that way were all people would assume were extroverts. Whatever it was, they had these masks on that people couldn't get through or were so well disguised, people didn't know it was happening.
And so that's where the concept of a mental wealth team comes into it, I presume.
Yes.
Who should be in your mental wealth team, or how do you go about building one?
First thing we need to know is who we've got in our team already, because quite often people have got all sorts of connections that are there and they think they're great, but actually they're not fit for purpose for the way forward. Over my time, I've worked with professional elite sports people retiring from their career in their sport. Yesterday, they had 35 people keeping them on the track or on the pitch or wherever it was. The guillotine comes down retirement in place. Now that team is not fit for purpose for the way forward.
Wow.
And this is what happens. So we find we flit as we transition through different stages of our lives, where there are certain people who were great for us at one point, but they're no longer fit for purpose going forward.
And like we were saying while we were off air, how I've moved down to Swanage in the last couple of years. And I know we still have remote communications and Zoom and all the rest of it. But I've noticed that the people I'm in regular contact with have changed.
They will do. And it's that social bubble that we work within, and it's knowing who they are and how to ask for better help, because that's one of the things that we're terrible at, asking for help, because it's perceived as a sign of weakness. Whereas actually, just having conversations with the right people and those people asking us better questions keeps us true to the direction we need to follow, even though sometimes it might not be what we want to do initially.
And what kind of people should we be putting into our team?
I build this up of 4 different sections. Firstly, I'll talk about self-care. So self-care is obviously well-being, meditation, mindfulness, nutrition, everything around that. And I'd include in that things that you do that makes you a bit weird and different. So for you and your activities under the water, many people putting a mask on their face absolutely can't, the whole idea of it, and having some little music going in the background where there's a big fish with large teeth, because of course you get a lot of them around Swanage.
Absolutely.
But that's people, their perception there is that wouldn't work for them. That's fine. But I do strange things that are right for me, that keep me fit, that keep me healthy, that keep me balanced. So the self-care is the starting block. I've always joked about, in my family, I was number 6. 3 children, my wife and a dog. And I was then number 6. Clearly, if I'm not number 1, then how can I be fit for purpose for looking after the rest of my 5 if I'm not looking after myself properly? So part of that self-care is putting yourself number 1. And that feels like being selfish, which may or may not be good in our interpretation, but it's actually what we should be doing to make it right for how we go forward. So self-care, number 1. Second one is the coach. Now, obviously, that's my world of business. I do a lot of coaching. If you've got a coach, they're going to get more out of you than you will on your own. And that's in business, that's in sport, that's in school. When you've got the right person challenging you, provoking you, they will get more out of you than you do on your own. Third section is the professional support team. And that is wealth, accountancy, and legal. Some of the mistakes I've made in business and in personal investments and other things like that have been at the time when my professional team weren't fit for purpose for what I needed at that time. So I made decisions that in hindsight were either rash or not fully seen through, didn't do enough due diligence, etc., etc. And when those mistakes happened, it was because I didn't have that right support network. And whilst they're not necessarily all on speed dial, they're available when you're going to do something. So they will ask better questions than you ask yourself, because you're emotionally connected to it. And they're turning around and saying, from a very, very black and white perspective, is this good, bad, or indifferent? Bearing in mind where you've said you want to get to by the time you're 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever it happens to be. And then the final area is the mastermind group or the peer support groups. And that is where you are open, honest, and vulnerable, challenging everybody else in that group, and they're doing the same back to you. And it's in confidence, so you're not worried about giving away your crown jewels and everybody running off with them, but you've got that support. And then the times when you're not in the hot seat, you're dishing or giving the same consultancy type questions, the same challenging questions, which gets the other person thinking, but it also reminds you that you're being a hypocrite because you're challenging John that you should be doing X, Y, and Z, and you don't do it yourself.
Yep.
Cumulatively, between those 4 areas, you can get to 8 to 15 people who've got your back, challenging you. And they're not necessarily your best friends. They're not necessarily your family. They're independent, and they've got a great view of what you should and shouldn't be doing to help you go where you want to be going. And that's part of that direction and purpose and everything else that you need. Yeah. And it's that focus of having those people there challenging you so you can achieve what you need to.
How well do you think leaders in larger companies understand mental health and this concept of mental wealth?
It really depends on the leadership. And I believe the leadership going forward, through coming out of the back of COVID and everything else, historically, poor managers have managed through presenteeism, making sure people are in place the whole time, so that because they can't trust them if they're not able to see them. This whole pandemic has changed that approach. So weaker managers will have to or have moved on, and the new generation will come through with stronger managers and leaders, because they've got to inspire at arm's length, motivate from distance, and get people working with you. And all of that means if they've got their back and they're looking out for their team, giving them scope to take the time they required, work with that. I personally am just going into a good old 10 days of isolation because of a close contact COVID diagnosis. Not for me, but for somebody in my family. So suddenly I've got 10 days where, in theory, if I was working for a large organization, that leadership might be questioning, what am I doing every day? Where am I? How's it all working? So the leadership have to be stronger in inspiring, trusting, and motivating their staff, which will then build on the mental wealth and therefore prevent mental health challenges coming along. No perfect solution, though.
And the role of the individual then underneath that leader is to create their own mental wealth team.
Totally, yes.
Brilliant, thank you. Just before we finish, could I ask for a tip for an introvert around mental health?
I would say around mental wealth, because I'm a mental wealth expert rather than a mental health expert.
Nice distinction.
The hardest part is asking for help, but that's not synonymous just to introverts. That's for all of us. But by asking for help, we're giving people permission to give us advice and thoughts. Whether we act upon it or not, that's still our choice. But the people we truly trust, we ask them for their advice, and suddenly that group can expand and snowball.
And tip for a non-introvert around mental wealth?
Listen, one of the biggest things, which I believe is our absolute duty in the world of mental wealth and mental health, is we need to be listening better and listening to the things that are unspoken. And when we listen to the things that are unspoken, we will ask better questions. And those better questions will raise flags. And when those flags are raised, we can take action and we can help.
And the questions are about what we've listened to rather than the things that we're deciding to ask about before we even get around to listening.
Absolutely, yes.
The book's called Mental Wealth, Unlock Your Potential and Enrich Your Life. Where can people get hold of it?
MikePagan.com. That's Pagan, as in the religion.
It's been great to talk to you. It's lovely to catch up after all this time, Mike. Thanks a lot for your time.
No problem. I look forward to seeing you in the water at some point soon.
Oh, yes. And now it's time for Introvert Myth of the Week. Those crazy stories that I hear and you hear that some people actually believe. Following on from Mike's point, does having a loud voice mean you're not an introvert? I started asking around after this chat with Mike, and many people assume that loud people are extroverts. It may well be fair to assume that the people who are always the loudest and most garrulous in a group are extroverted. But introverts do and will be loud on occasions. Having a loud voice or the ability to project well is simply biology. Choosing to be loud in a group at times is something introverts can do. It's one of the tactics that many people have learnt to be successful. Always being the loud one in the group, whatever the group, might well mean you're much more likely to be extroverted. So no, having a loud voice does not mean you're an extrovert, but if you're always the loud one, you probably are.
I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.